They entered the war with an illusion of permanence, a belief that the elite pilot force that had conquered the skies over Poland, France, and the early months of the Eastern Front would always exist, always replenish itself, always dominate. In 1939 and 1940, the Luftwaffe seemed unstoppable, its Jagdgeschwader filled with men forged in the Condor Legion over Spain and hardened in combat operations across Europe. These were pilots who had fought dozens, sometimes hundreds of sorties before the Allies had even begun expanding their own air forces. The Luftwaffe's ace culture, embodied by figures like Werner Melders, Adolf Galland, and Günter Lützow, created an aura of invincibility. But beneath that aura lay a system dangerously unbalanced. Germany had built an air force around exceptional individuals, not around an industrial-scale training pipeline. The Allies had done the opposite. And in that strategic difference lay the seed of a crisis so vast and so fatal that by 1944 the Luftwaffe would be losing the air war, not because it lacked aircraft, but because it lacked the men capable of flying them. Early victories masked everything. The Blitzkrieg required air superiority, and the Luftwaffe delivered it with astonishing efficiency. But the very speed of German success created a trap. Because the war moved so fast, Germany delayed expanding its flight schools. Because early battles cost relatively few veteran pilots, the Luftwaffe believed its training system was adequate. Because aces were so dominant, the high command assumed experience would continue flowing naturally from the front back into the training units. None of these assumptions were true. In reality, the Luftwaffe's training structure, designed for a short, decisive conflict, was incapable of sustaining long-term attrition. Training was centralized, slow to adapt, and starved of aircraft and fuel even before the war intensified. Germany entered Barbarossa in 1941 with a pilot force that was undeniably elite, but also fragile, too small, too overworked, and too dependent on its veterans. And then the real war began. Barbarossa consumed pilots at a rate the Luftwaffe had never anticipated. The Eastern Front was a vast, punishing battlefield stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, requiring air power across thousands of miles. Pilots flew 4, 5, sometimes 8 sorties a day, pushing both man and machine far beyond peacetime expectations. Combat losses were only part of the problem. Mechanical failures, forced landings, treacherous weather, and primitive Soviet airfields ate away at Germany's pool of seasoned aviators. Every crew lost was irreplaceable. In 1942, the fighting over Stalingrad, the Caucasus, and Energev salient continued that attrition. Luftwaffe units survived only because of their veterans, the handful of men who could spot enemies at impossible distances, evade entire Allied formations, and keep younger pilots alive. These veterans formed the spine of the Luftwaffe, and one by one, that spine began to break. As the war expanded into North Africa and the Mediterranean, German fighter units were stretched across continents. Tunisia in early 1943 became a graveyard for experienced pilots who faced the combined strength of the U.S. Air Forces and the RAF. New American fighters like the P-38 and improved Spitfire variants inflicted heavy losses. Every veteran killed in Tunisia represented hundreds of hours of irreplaceable combat experience. Meanwhile, Germany's training command was already faltering. Even in 1942, training hours were being reduced because the war demanded every drop of fuel for the front. Flight schools began rationing flying time, switching to more classroom teaching, less real flying. Young pilots graduated with fewer hours, weaker formation skills, and minimal exposure to real combat environments. Yet they were sent into the most dangerous skies on Earth. Then came the catastrophe that exposed the crisis to the world. Big Week, February 20th to 25th, 1944. The U.S. 8th Air Force and 15th Air Force launched massive raids against German aircraft factories. The goal was not only to destroy production facilities, but to force the Luftwaffe into battle and kill its remaining veterans. It worked. Hundreds of experienced German pilots were shot down in a single week. Aircraft production recovered. Pilot losses did not. The truth was now undeniable. Germany was producing fighters faster than at any point in the war, but the pilots who once made those fighters deadly were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe had entered the war with the best pilots in the world. By 1944, it was becoming an air force of undertrained, inexperienced boys thrown into hopeless combat against overwhelming Allied air superiority. The hidden crisis was no longer hidden. It was unfolding in the skies over Europe every single day. And as the Allies continued to strengthen their air forces, Germany's shortage of trained pilots would become one of the decisive factors that doomed the Reich.
The Luftwaffe's crisis did not emerge in a single catastrophic moment. It unfolded in a series of grinding campaigns that consumed Germany's most skilled pilots far faster than they could be replaced. Each theater of war became a drain on the Luftwaffe's irreplaceable core of combat veterans, and each loss weakened the very foundation on which Germany's air superiority had been built. Nowhere was this more devastating than on the Eastern Front. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the Luftwaffe entered Soviet airspace with confidence. For weeks, German fighters and bombers savaged the Red Air Force, destroying thousands of aircraft on the ground and hundreds more in the air. Victory appeared overwhelming. But Barbarossa was not the blitzkrieg of Poland or France. It was a war of colossal distances, brutal weather, and constant operational strain. Luftwaffe pilots flew from primitive airfields carved out of grasslands and forests. They operated without proper maintenance facilities, lacking spare parts, hangars, and even paved runways. Mud, dust, snow, and ice tore apart aircraft. Engines ingested debris. Tires burst on makeshift strips. Fatal accidents soared. Even when pilots survived mechanical failures, forced landings behind enemy lines often meant capture or death. Worse still, the sheer scale of daily operations was unsustainable. Aces such as Werner Molders, Hermann Graf, and Walter Novotny flew missions at a tempo unheard of in the West. 5, 6, even 8 sorties per day. Each sortie offered an opportunity for victory, but also for exhaustion, error, or a fatal encounter with Soviet fighters or anti-aircraft fire. As the Soviet Air Force recovered in 1942 and 1943, their newer aircraft, Yak-9s, La-5FNs, and Lend-Lease P-39s, began taking a heavier toll. Slowly, steadily, the Eastern Front consumed Germany's airborne elite. Those who survived were often pushed into other collapsing theaters. North Africa became another graveyard. Tunisia in early 1943 was catastrophic. German fighter groups already strained from battles over Malta and the Mediterranean now faced the combined air power of the RAF and the rapidly expanding U.S. Army Air Forces. American P-38 Lightnings, with their long range and heavy firepower, proved formidable opponents. Spitfire Mk5s and IXs challenged German fighters at low and medium altitudes, and Allied radar-controlled interception meant Luftwaffe pilots were often outnumbered before they even knew a fight had begun. Critical units like JG-27 and elements of JG-53 lost some of their most experienced men during the Tunisian campaign. Supply shortages made everything worse. Fuel shipments from Italy were sporadic. Replacement aircraft arrived in limited numbers. Maintenance was a luxury. When Tunisia fell in May 1943, the Luftwaffe lost not only territory, but also a generation of seasoned pilots who had once been the backbone of Germany's fighter arm. Yet the single greatest slaughter of Luftwaffe veterans came not in Russia or North Africa, but in the skies over Germany itself. In February 1944, the United States launched Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, a massive coordinated assault on Germany's aircraft manufacturing industry. The strategic goal was to cripple production, but the tactical purpose was even more direct: force the Luftwaffe into battle and destroy its remaining veteran pilots. It succeeded with brutal efficiency. During Big Week, the 8th Air Force and 15th Air Force hurled waves of B-17s, B-24s, P-47s, P-38s, and the newly arrived P-51 Mustangs into German airspace. The Luftwaffe responded because it had to. If it failed to defend its factories, Germany's entire aircraft supply chain might collapse. But every time Germany committed its fighters, it lost more of its best men. American long-range escorts neutralized the Luftwaffe's previous tactic of attacking bombers unopposed. The P-51 Mustang in particular turned the air war upside down. It was fast, maneuverable, long-ranged, and deadly in a dive. German pilots who had survived years of combat suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by disciplined American formations, coordinated radar guidance, and overwhelming numerical superiority. Big Week cost the Allies aircraft and crews, but it devastated the Luftwaffe's fighter force. Hundreds of German pilots were killed or wounded, including many of the remaining veterans who had mentored younger pilots. Aircraft factories were damaged, but production eventually recovered. What did not recover was pilot quality. The Luftwaffe could replace a Bf-109 in a matter of days. It could not replace the men who flew them. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe pilot corps had been hollowed out. Entire Jagdgeschwader now relied on undertrained replacements with no combat experience. Veteran leaders were dead, missing, exhausted, or unable to pass on their knowledge because they flew combat sorties until the day they died. This was the moment the crisis ceased to be hidden. From 1941 to 1944, Germany had burned through its finest aviators in an air war it could no longer win. The Luftwaffe still had planes, more every month, but the men who made those planes deadly had vanished into the snows of Russia, the sands of Tunisia, and the contrails of Big Week. The true cost of losing its veterans was only beginning to unfold, and the consequences would soon cascade through every remaining Luftwaffe unit.
By the time Germany realized it was losing its veteran pilots faster than it could replace them, the Luftwaffe training system had already begun to collapse under pressures it was never designed to withstand. What had started the war as a streamlined, high-quality program intended to produce elite aviators for a short, decisive conflict, slowly deteriorated into a desperate, under-resourced pipeline, turning out barely trained boys who were expected to face the most formidable air forces in history. They would die in staggering numbers, not because they lacked courage, but because they had never been given the skills to survive. Before the war, German pilot training was exceptional. Cadets received more than 200 hours of flight time, practiced aerobatics, formation flying, navigation, advanced gunnery, and blind flying. Instructors were experienced frontline veterans who passed on the instincts required for air combat. Graduates entered Jagdgeschwader as polished aviators ready for combat. But the Luftwaffe made one fatal assumption, that the war would remain short. When the conflict expanded across Europe, North Africa, and Russia, training schools began losing their instructors to frontline combat units. Veteran pilots were routinely pulled out of flight schools because the squadrons needed experienced leaders more desperately than they needed teachers. This robbed the training system of its most critical resource, expertise. Then came the fuel shortages. In 1942, Hitler diverted enormous quantities of aviation gasoline to the Eastern Front and North Africa. The training command found itself rationed. Flying hours were slashed. By mid-1942, trainees were receiving around 120–140 hours, a significant reduction, but still manageable. Then 1943 arrived, and with it the bombing of Germany's synthetic fuel plants. After the fall of Tunisia and the intensification of Allied strategic bombing, fuel shipments to training units dropped sharply. Instructors were ordered to conserve fuel by cutting flight time even further. Students who once practiced spins, dives, and emergency procedures now spent hours in classrooms with chalkboards instead of cockpits. By early 1944, many trainees were receiving fewer than 80 hours of total flight time, barely half the pre-war standard. Worse still, those hours were fragmented, inconsistent, and often flown in outdated or worn-out trainer aircraft that behaved nothing like frontline Bf-109s or FW-190s. Training became improvisational, rushed, and dangerously incomplete. Night flying? Eliminated. Blind flying? Severely curtailed. Gunnery practice? Minimal. Formation tactics? Rarely taught. Survival skills? Not even addressed. Meanwhile, Allied pilot training programs were expanding exponentially. American and British flyers regularly graduated with 200–300 hours of high-quality flight training, including fighter-specific instruction in advanced trainers. Many had already flown formation intercepts, practiced deflection shooting,
and trained in simulated combat scenarios before they ever saw enemy territory. German trainees, by contrast, sometimes met an Allied fighter for the first time in the split second before they were shot down. Compounding everything was the physical destruction of the training infrastructure. Allied bombers targeted Luftwaffe flight schools, fuel depots, and aircraft plants. Several major training bases were relocated repeatedly, interrupting curricula and scattering resources. In some cases, instructors had to teach in open fields after their airfields were cratered. The Luftwaffe tried to compensate by creating accelerated crash courses, but these programs only made the problem worse. Recruits who should have spent months mastering aerobatics were instead rushed into cockpits after a few dozen hours of basic flying. Many died in training accidents before ever reaching the front. Those who survived were sent into combat with a level of preparation wholly inadequate for the realities of 1944 air warfare. The result was predictable and tragic, a staggering spike in rookie casualties. Units like JJ-26 on the Western Front and JJ-54 in the East found themselves receiving replacements who could barely take off and land safely. New pilots often made fatal mistakes within minutes of joining combat formations, climbing too steeply, losing sight of their leader, stalling in turns, or failing to monitor their 6 o'clock. Allied pilots could immediately identify inexperienced German flyers. They flew predictably, hesitated in evasive maneuvers, and lacked the situational awareness needed to survive the swirling chaos of high-altitude battles. Veterans who remained were forced to compensate, protecting the rookies while fighting overwhelming odds. But each time a veteran was killed, the problem worsened. There were fewer mentors, fewer instructors, fewer survivors to pass on the knowledge that had once defined the Luftwaffe. The training system was not just struggling, it was cannibalizing itself. In the end, Germany's failure was not merely strategic or material, it was educational. The Luftwaffe's greatest weapon had been its pilots, and its greatest mistake was assuming those pilots could be replaced quickly, cheaply, or with reduced standards. By the middle of 1944, the truth was undeniable. Germany did not run out of planes. It ran out of time, fuel, instructors, and above all, trained pilots. The crisis that had once been hidden was now devouring the Luftwaffe from within.
By 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter wings, once the pride of Germany, revered across Europe for their skill and lethality, had become shadows of their former selves. Units that had dominated the skies in 1940 and 1941 were now trapped in a vicious cycle. Fewer veterans meant less effective combat leadership, less mentorship for rookies, and more dead rookies who never had a chance to become veterans themselves. No amount of aircraft production could fix this. Germany could roll out hundreds of Bf-109Gs and Fw-190As each month, but without trained pilots, they were nothing more than metal shells waiting to be destroyed. And nowhere was this collapse more visible than in the Jagdgeschwader, the elite fighter wings whose reputations had once terrified Allied airmen. JG-54, the Green Hearts, had started the war as one of the most effective units on the Eastern Front. Flying from bases around Leningrad, its aces, Hannes Trautloft, Walter Novotny, and Otto Kittel, racked up staggering kill counts against the poorly trained and poorly equipped early Soviet Air Force. But this success came at a terrible hidden cost. Because veteran pilots were so effective, they were kept at the front indefinitely. They never rotated home, they never served as instructors, they simply fought until they died. By 1943, as Soviet aviation modernized and gained numerical superiority, JG-54's attrition rates skyrocketed. Pilots who had once been surrounded by skilled comrades now found themselves leading groups of inexperienced replacements. The Eastern Front did not forgive inexperience. Many new pilots died within their first week. Some died on their first mission. When Walter Novotny, one of the unit's brightest stars, was shot down and killed in November 1944, it symbolized the end of JG-54's golden age. The unit still flew missions, but its quality had collapsed. It had become a wing in name only, its former strength hollowed out by an attritional war it could no longer master. On the Western Front, JG-26 Schlageter faced an even harsher reality. JG-26 had been Adolf Gallant's unit during the Battle of Britain, and it had maintained a reputation as one of the finest fighter groups in Germany. But by 1943-44, the skies over France and Belgium were no longer the hunting grounds of elite Germans. They were kill zones dominated by American P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and especially P-51 Mustangs. Allied fighters flew farther, climbed higher, dived faster, and were guided by increasingly sophisticated radar networks. The Luftwaffe no longer chose when to fight, the Allies chose for them. Every bomber raid forced the German fighters into the air, whether they were ready or not. And every time JG-26 scrambled to face waves of B-17s and B-24s escorted by swarms of Mustangs, another handful of irreplaceable veterans were lost. Replacements arrived, but they were scarcely trained. Many had never fired their weapons in realistic conditions. They joined formations filled with young men who had logged less than 70 hours of flight time. When they faced the Americans, the outcome was inevitable. The Western Jagdgeschwader suffered casualty rates so high that some units effectively reintegrated new pilots on an hourly basis. They might join their squadron at dawn and be dead by noon. This accelerated death cycle drained the Luftwaffe faster than the factories could replenish it. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front continued to devour what few experienced pilots remained. Units such as JG-52, home to Erich Hartmann and Gerhard Barkhorn, held out longer thanks to their extraordinary leadership, but even they began losing pilots faster than they could replace them. The Soviets now fielded Yak-3s, Yak-9Us, and L-7s, modern fighters flown by seasoned aviators who had learned the hard way how to survive and win. The old days of easeless German dominance were over. Even the introduction of technological marvels like the Me-262 jet fighter could not reverse the trend. The Me-262 was fast and revolutionary, but most pilots assigned to fly it had never operated a jet engine before. Many had fewer than a dozen hours of training flights. Some died simply trying to take off or land. The few experienced pilots who could truly exploit the jet's capabilities, men like Adolf Galland and Walter Novotny, were far too few in number, and many were killed in the very first months of Me-262 deployment. By the time the Luftwaffe reached 1945, its fighter wings were organizational labels attached to ruined shells. JG-26 and JG-54 still existed on paper, but their operational reality was tragic. Squadrons that once housed aces now held terrified teenagers shaking in the cockpits of aircraft they barely understood. Tactical cohesion evaporated. Formation discipline collapsed. Morale disintegrated. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm no longer fought to win air superiority. It fought simply to survive another day. And as the last veterans fell, the wings that had once been the steel spine of the Reich simply dissolved into attritional dust.
By 1944, Germany was producing fighter aircraft at a pace that astonished even the Allies. Fueled by Albert Speer's reforms and the decentralization of the aviation industry, monthly production of Bf-109s and FW-190s rose to unprecedented levels. In 1944 alone, Germany manufactured more than 35,000 fighter aircraft, a figure that dwarfed its output from earlier years. On paper, the Luftwaffe should have been stronger than ever, an expanding air force equipped with modern, deadly machines. But in reality, it was collapsing, because an aircraft is only as effective as the pilot who flies it, and Germany had run out of pilots long before it ran out of planes. The signs were everywhere. Airfields across the Reich filled with brand new fighters that never flew a single combat sortie. Some remained parked because there were no pilots to assign to them. Others were flown only for a few minutes before mechanical failure or crash landings destroyed them, testimony to the inexperience of their operators. The Luftwaffe's command structure watched helplessly as its frontline units received waves of undertrained replacements who could not survive, much less dominate, modern aerial combat. Allied air forces now controlled both the skies and the training pipeline, producing veteran-quality pilots faster than Germany could send rookies to their deaths. The mismatch was terminal. The consequences stretched across every theater. The Me-262 jet, Germany's most advanced fighter, symbolized the crisis better than any other aircraft. Technologically, it was a marvel, capable of speeds far beyond Allied piston fighters. In the hands of experienced aviators, it could tear apart bomber formations. But the pilots Germany assigned to the jet program were often teenagers with only a few dozen hours of flight time. They did not understand jet handling, throttle lag, or dangerous landing speeds. Dozens of Me-262s were lost not to combat, but to takeoff and landing accidents. The Luftwaffe had built the future of air combat, but had no pilots left to fly it. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy collapsed. Fighter groups intended to intercept Allied bombers fell into disarray. Without veteran leaders, formations broke apart under pressure. Rookies climbed too steeply, stalled in turns, or fixated on a single target while ignoring their surroundings. The discipline that had once defined German fighter units disappeared. Allied fighters exploited every weakness. P-51 squadrons dove through German formations like wolves into a flock of sheep. Radar networks, once effective under the direction of seasoned controllers, faltered as the Luftwaffe lost not only pilots but experienced ground personnel. The collapse of skill was total: air, ground, command, tactics. The strategic impact was catastrophic. Without air superiority, Germany could not defend its factories, railways, oil refineries, or cities. The bombing of the Reich intensified, devastating its industrial core. Synthetic fuel plants, critical to the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht, were obliterated by B-17s and B-24s. These raids succeeded not because of new bombs or better tactics, but simply because there were not enough German pilots left to stop them. By late 1944, Allied bombers were flying over Germany with minimal resistance. Many raids encountered only a few scattered German fighters, often led by one surviving veteran surrounded by terrified novices. When these tiny formations attacked, Allied escorts swarmed them. Losses became so extreme that Luftwaffe commanders began holding their fighters back, hoping to preserve the last remnants of their air force. It didn't matter. The depletion was already irreversible. The effects on the ground war were equally devastating. Panzer divisions lost the air cover they once relied upon. German troops marching, retreating, or redeploying across Europe suffered constant Allied air attack. Bridges, columns, and supply dumps were destroyed at will. The Luftwaffe's failure meant the Wehrmacht could no longer maneuver. Even when Germany tried to launch ambitious operations, such as the Ardennes offensive, Allied air superiority turned them into death traps the moment the weather cleared. When the skies opened up, the offensive died, and with it died any last illusion that Germany could still shape the strategic direction of the war. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe had become little more than a token force. It still possessed aircraft on paper, but these figures were meaningless. A fighter with no trained pilot was not a weapon. It was debris waiting to happen. The Luftwaffe's final truth was brutally simple. Germany had lost the air war not for lack of machines, but for lack of men. No production miracle, no technological breakthrough, no last-minute wonder weapon could compensate for the destruction of its pilot corps. In the end, the Luftwaffe died the moment its veterans did. The fighter wings that once terrorized Europe fell silent, not because they lacked aircraft, but because their cockpits were empty.